I was still holding my plate when my mother-in-law told me to leave. Not after dinner. Not quietly in a corner where nobody would hear. Right there, in the middle of the dining room, with 16 people watching and the roast chicken still steaming on the table. Patricia Caldwell pointed at the front door and said, "You were never part of this family. You need to go. Now." I had been married to her son, Daniel, for 7 years. 7 years of holidays in that house. 7 years of cooking dishes nobody touched and smiling through comments that cut like broken glass. 7 years of being the woman who wasn't quite good enough, wasn't quite right, wasn't quite anything worth keeping. Daniel sat at the far end of the table. He heard every word. He looked down at his plate. Not at me. Not at his mother. Just down. Patricia stepped closer, her voice dropping into something colder. "After today, you won't get a single thing from this house. Not one penny. Not one memory. Nothing." My hands were shaking. I could feel the warmth of the plate through my fingers, and I remember thinking how strange it was to notice that small detail in that enormous moment. I set the plate down carefully, picked up my bag, and I walked toward the door. Then the lawyer behind me cleared his throat and said, "Actually, no one leaves yet." Before we continue with our story, please like and comment the time you're watching this story, and also hit the subscribe button if you like stories like this. I stopped walking. The room went completely still. Even Patricia stopped breathing for a second. The only sound was the tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, the one Daniel's father, Raymond Caldwell, had bought at an auction 30 years ago. Raymond had been gone for 3 weeks. That was why we were all here today. The reading of his will. The lawyer's name was Mr. Felix Hartwell. He was a small, neat man with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of quiet confidence that made you listen without knowing why. He had driven in from Columbus that morning. He had barely spoken 2 words since he arrived. Now he spoke clearly. "Everyone needs to remain seated, please." Mr. Caldwell left specific instructions for this meeting, and those instructions have not yet been fully carried out. Patricia turned on him. "She is not family. She does not belong in this room." Mr. Hartwell looked at her over his glasses without blinking. "Your late husband gave very specific instructions about her presence here today. I am bound to follow those instructions exactly." The room shifted. I felt every eye turn toward me. Patricia's sister, Aunt Constance, leaned forward. Daniel's brother, Warren, frowned. Even the cousins who had ignored me for years suddenly couldn't look away. I stood near the door, unsure whether to move forward or stay still. Then Daniel finally looked up. But not at me. He looked at the brown envelope in Mr. Hartwell's hands. I had assumed there was one envelope. Everyone had assumed that. Raymond's main will had already been read earlier that afternoon. Properties listed, accounts summarized, instructions for the business. It was straightforward. Almost boring. Patricia had sat through it with a small satisfied smile, like a woman collecting what she had always been owed. But now Mr. Hartwell reached into his leather case and produced a second envelope. Sealed. Cream-colored. Thicker than the first. Patricia's smile disappeared. "What is that?" she asked. Mr. Hartwell set it on the table in front of him. "This is a supplementary document prepared by Raymond Caldwell 14 months ago. It was lodged separately with my office and sealed under specific conditions." "What conditions?" Warren asked. Mr. Hartwell looked at me, then back at the room. "It was to be opened only under certain circumstances. Those circumstances have now occurred." Patricia's voice sharpened. "That document has nothing to do with this meeting. We've heard the will. We're done." "We are not done," Mr. Hartwell said. His tone didn't change. Not louder, not softer. Just certain. "And I would advise everyone to remain calm." Patricia looked around the room for support. Aunt Constance looked away. Warren pressed his lips together. Daniel had gone very still. Mr. Hartwell picked up the envelope. Patricia said, "I want that ignored." He didn't even pause. His thumb slid under the seal. The sound of that envelope opening was the loudest thing I had ever heard in a quiet room. Patricia stood up straight. I'm telling you that is not a legal document. Raymond was not himself in his last months. Anyone who was there can tell you that. He was confused. He was emotional. He was sharp enough to sign this in front of 2 licensed witnesses and a notary, Mr. Hartwell replied. Both witnesses are available by phone if anyone wishes to verify. Nobody said they did. Daniel leaned forward. Mom, what is this? What's in there? She answered too quickly. Nothing. It's nothing. That word, nothing, sat in the air like smoke. Because when someone says nothing that fast, with that much force behind it, they already know it's something. Mr. Hartwell unfolded the pages. He smoothed them flat against the table with one careful hand. He read the first line silently, then looked up and adjusted his glasses. I'll begin, he said. The room leaned in without realizing it. Aunt Constance put down her teacup. Warren stopped tapping his foot. Even the 2 cousins near the window stopped whispering. I was still standing near the door. My bag was still in my hand. Mr. Hartwell began to read. And the first line he read out loud mentioned me by name. To my daughter-in-law, Andrea. Gasps moved around the table like a wave. Aunt Constance pressed her hand to her mouth. Warren blinked twice. Daniel's face went completely blank, like someone had wiped it clean. Mr. Hartwell continued reading Raymond's words in the same calm, measured voice. To the only person in this house who never treated me like an obligation. To the woman who sat with me on Tuesday afternoons when everyone else was too busy. To Andrea, who brought me soup when I had no appetite and read to me when my eyes were too tired for books. I want you to know that I saw you. I always saw you. The room was absolutely silent. Patricia had not sat back down. She stood at the end of the table like a woman bracing for a car crash she couldn't stop. Mr. Hartwell kept reading. There are things about this family that you may not know. Things I was too polite to say while I was alive. Things I should have said a long time ago. This letter is my last chance to tell the truth. Patricia's voice cracked. This is dramatic nonsense. Raymond was always sentimental. This doesn't mean anything legally. I haven't finished, Mr. Hartwell said. He stopped talking. He turned the page. And the room braced itself for whatever was coming next. Raymond Caldwell had been watching. That was the thing none of them expected. They had seen him as a quiet old man in the last years of his life, slower than he used to be, a little hard of hearing, easy to overlook at the end of a long table. Patricia had spoken for him at family gatherings for years. Daniel had nodded along. Warren had filled his plate and changed the subject whenever Raymond tried to speak. But Raymond had been paying close attention the whole time. Mr. Hartwell read his words slowly. I have watched my daughter-in-law be excluded from family photographs. I have watched her cook for this family and not be thanked. I have watched my wife tell her in front of others that she was not good enough. I have watched my son say nothing. Daniel's jaw tightened. I kept a record, Mr. Hartwell continued. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew that one day, the truth would need to be louder than the lies. Patricia laughed. A short, sharp sound not quite real. A record. He kept a record. That's absurd. He did, Mr. Hartwell confirmed. He was not reading anymore. He was looking at Patricia directly. And I have it here. He reached into his leather case a second time. Patricia's laugh disappeared completely. The photographs were printed cleanly on white paper. 12 of them, tucked inside a clear folder that Mr. Hartwell placed flat on the table. He didn't spread them out dramatically. He simply slid the folder to the center where everyone could see. The first photograph showed me at Ridgecrest Medical Center, sitting in a plastic chair outside Raymond's room. It was taken from down the hallway, slightly blurry, clearly from a phone. I was wearing my gray coat, the one I bought the year Daniel and I got married. I was reading a book. A coffee cup sat on the floor beside my feet. I remembered that afternoon. It was a Wednesday in October 2 winters ago. Raymond had had a procedure on his knee. Patricia hadn't come. She said she had a lunch she couldn't cancel. Daniel had stayed in the parking lot for 40 minutes, then said he had a work call and left. I had stayed for 6 hours. The second photograph showed me at Raymond's house, sitting at the kitchen table with him, both of us leaning over a crossword puzzle. He was laughing. I was pointing at something on the page. The photo had a date stamp in the corner. It was Christmas Day. Everyone else in the family had gone to Patricia's sister's house that year. They had not invited Raymond. They said the drive was too long for him. I had gone to him instead. Warren stared at the photographs. He didn't speak. Mr. Hartwell said, "And now the financial records." The shift in the room was immediate. When photographs are on the table, people can look away. They can find reasons to doubt them, to explain them, to reframe them as something less than what they are. But numbers are harder to argue with. Dates and amounts and account statements printed in black ink don't respond to tone of voice. Mr. Hartwell produced a second set of documents. These were thicker, stapled together in 3 separate packets. He placed one in the center of the table, kept one for himself, and set the third to his left. Over the past 4 years, he said, approximately $62,000 was withdrawn from Raymond Caldwell's personal savings account in irregular transfers. These transfers did not appear in the main estate summary because they were removed before that summary was compiled. The room went cold. I hadn't known about this. I stood near the door still holding my bag, and I felt my stomach drop. Aunt Constance turned slowly toward Patricia. Warren looked at his hands. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. Patricia moved first. She pointed at me, her finger sharp and certain. She had access to that account. She was always over at the house. Always alone with him. It was her. Everyone knew something wasn't right. Mr. Hartwell let her finish. Then he said, calmly and without a trace of hesitation, "We anticipated that accusation." The documents Mr. Hartwell placed on the table next were not photographs. They were bank records, timestamp transaction logs, security camera footage printed as still images from the bank branch on Linden Avenue, 3 miles from Raymond's house. None of the images showed me. Mr. Hartwell walked through each one without rushing. The first withdrawal 18 months ago, a Tuesday morning. I had been at work. My employer's attendance log, already attached, confirmed it. The second withdrawal, a Friday afternoon. I had been at a dentist appointment. The receipt was there, stapled to the page. Each transaction had been cross-referenced. Each one had been carefully, thoroughly disproved as being connected to me. Daniel had gone pale. Not the pale of shock, the pale of someone who is beginning to do very uncomfortable math in their head. Patricia tried to speak twice. Both times Mr. Hartwell simply continued reading, and the room stayed with him. When he finished, Aunt Constance looked at Patricia with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger. Something quieter and sadder than anger. Disappointment that had finally run out of places to hide. Warren picked up one of the documents and stared at it. Mr. Hartwell straightened his papers. "But this," he said, "is not the real reason we are here today." He turned to the next page. "And I finally stopped holding Raymond had built a condition into the will. Not a suggestion. Not a hope. A legal condition, drafted carefully, reviewed by Mr. Hartwell's office, and signed in front of witnesses 14 months before Raymond died. Mr. Hartwell explained it the way a person explains something they have explained before, clearly, without drama, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The condition was simple. After Raymond's death, I was to be treated with basic dignity by the family. Included in the will reading. Spoken to respectfully. Not removed from the room. If those conditions were met, the estate would be distributed as outlined in the main will. The house, the accounts, the business shares divided among Patricia, Daniel, and Warren as originally planned. If those conditions were violated, specifically if I was publicly humiliated, dismissed, or asked to leave before the reading was complete, a separate clause would automatically take effect. One that Raymond had prepared for exactly this situation. The room was absolutely quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. Patricia had sat back down at some point during the reading. I hadn't noticed when. She was very still now, her hands flat on the table, her face the color of old paper. She was doing the same math Daniel had been doing. And she had just reached the answer. Mr. Hartwell looked at her over his glasses. Based on what occurred approximately 12 minutes ago, he said, the secondary clause is now active. My breath. Patricia stood up again. She couldn't stay seated. She needed to move, to fill the room with her presence the way she always had, to take up enough space that there was no room left for consequences. This is not valid, she said. Raymond was not in his right mind when he signed this. I'll contest every word of it. Mr. Hartwell didn't flinch. Mr. Caldwell's mental competency at the time of signing was certified by 2 independent physicians. Both certifications are attached to the original document, which is filed with the Claremont County Probate Court. I don't care where it's filed. You should, he said. Still calm. Still precise. Because contesting this document, given the physician certifications, the witness signatures, and the detailed record Raymond kept over the past 3 years, would be an extremely difficult case to make. And an expensive one. Aunt Constance reached over and touched Patricia's arm. Patricia pulled away. Warren was staring at the table. He hadn't spoken in several minutes. Daniel looked at me for the first time since I had walked toward the door. His eyes were uncertain. Not sorry, I want to be clear about that. Uncertain. Like a man who had just realized the ground he was standing on was not as solid as he thought. Mr. Hartwell picked up the second set of pages. Let me continue, he said. And the room fell silent again, because no one had any real choice but to listen. The primary asset affected by this clause, Mr. Hartwell read, is the residential property located at 14 Birchwood Lane. That was this house. The house Patricia had lived in for 31 years. The house where Daniel and Warren had grown up. The house with the grandfather clock in the hallway and the rose bushes Patricia tended every spring, and the kitchen where I had stood for 7 years, washing dishes after meals where nobody asked how I was doing. Raymond had bought this house with his own money before he and Patricia married. It had always been in his name alone. Patricia had never asked about that. She had assumed for 31 years that what was his was hers. Ownership of the residential property at 14 Birchwood Lane, Mr. Hartwell continued, is no longer directed to the surviving spouse as outlined in the original will. Patricia laughed. It was a strange sound. Hello. Like she was trying out a reaction and it didn't fit properly. That's not right, she said. That can't be right. Mr. Hartwell slid the document across the table toward her. She stared at it without picking it up. Daniel stood slowly. Mom, is this real? She didn't answer him. Mr. Hartwell looked over his glasses at me, and I realized I had stopped breathing again. The property at 14 Birchwood Lane, Mr. Hartwell said, is to be transferred in full to. He paused. Not a dramatic pause. Just the natural pause of a man reading carefully, making sure he had the right line, the right name. Everyone leaned forward. Aunt Constance, Warren, Daniel, the cousins by the window. Every single person in that room was perfectly still. I pressed my back against the wall near the door. I had not moved in several minutes. My bag was still in my hand. My coat was still on. I had spent 7 years in this house feeling like I was visiting someone else's life. Like I was tolerated rather than welcomed. Like every room in this building had a sign on the door that said, "Not for you." To Andrea Caldwell, Mr. Hartwell finished. The room erupted. Not one sound, a dozen sounds at once. Constance exhaled sharply. One of the cousins knocked over a glass. Warren pushed back from the table. Daniel's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his voice rising before he had even decided what to say. Patricia screamed. Not a word. Just a sound, raw and disbelieving, the sound a person makes when the story they have been telling themselves for 30 years turns out to have a different ending. Mr. Hartwell did not look up from his papers. There's more, he said. The room did not settle easily. Patricia was shaking. She grabbed the edge of the table with both hands like she needed it to hold her upright. Her voice came back sharp and fast. This is fraud. Raymond was manipulated. She was over here every week, filling his head with ideas. Patricia. Aunt Constance's voice was low and firm. Don't Patricia me, Connie. That woman. Stop. Constance stood up. She was 63 years old, small and quiet, the kind of person who had spent her life agreeing with her older sister to keep the peace. But she stood up straight and she said it clearly. Stop. We all heard what those documents said. We all saw those photographs. Stop. Patricia stared at her. For a moment nobody spoke. Daniel sat down slowly. He looked like a man trying to understand a problem too large to hold in both hands. This doesn't make sense, he said quietly. Not to Patricia. Not to me. Just to the room. She gets the house. There is additional detail, Mr. Hartwell said. He waited for the room to go quiet again. He was patient. He had clearly done this before. Warren finally spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. Keep reading, he said. Mr. Hartwell nodded once. He turned to the next section. And this time, when he began, he looked directly at my H. Raymond's letter addressed Daniel by name. Not gently. Not with the softness of a father who wanted to protect his son's feelings. Raymond Caldwell had been a quiet man, but his words on that page were not quiet. They were the words of someone who had thought carefully about what needed to be said and had decided that kindness, in this particular case, was not the same thing as the truth. Mr. Hartwell read without looking up. Daniel, you are my son and I love you. But I cannot leave this life without telling you something I should have said years ago. You have watched your wife be treated badly under my roof, at my table, in the company of our family. You have watched and you have said nothing. Not once. Not once in 7 years did you stand between her and the hurt. I do not believe you are a cruel man. I believe you are a weak one, and in many ways that is harder to forgive. Daniel's face was very still. I taught you to be kind. I did not teach you to be silent when someone you were supposed to love was being torn down. That silence was a choice. Every single time it was a choice. And choices have weight. The room was holding its breath. Because of that silence, Mr. Hartwell continued, his voice even and unhurried, Daniel's portion of the remaining estate has been adjusted. Daniel looked up. What does that mean? It means, Mr. Hartwell said, turning the page, that what you assumed was yours is no longer yours. Not entirely. Daniel had expected to inherit 40% of Raymond's financial accounts. That had been in the original will. 40% to Daniel, 40 to Patricia, 20 to Warren. A clean, straightforward split that Daniel had been counting on quietly for years. That split was gone. Mr. Hartwell read the revised numbers. Daniel's share had been reduced to 12%, held in a restricted account with conditions attached to its release. Daniel stood up. He can't do that. He did do that, Mr. Hartwell said. I'll challenge it. This whole thing is. Daniel. Mr. Hartwell set the papers down and looked at him directly. Your father prepared for this. The physician certifications I mentioned earlier apply to this document in its entirety. The witnesses are documented. Timeline is clear. If you choose to challenge this in probate court, you will spend significantly more than 12% in legal fees, and you will lose. Daniel sat back down. His hand was on the table and it was shaking slightly. Not from grief, from the specific, particular panic of a man watching something he believed was permanent dissolve in front of him. He looked at Patricia. She was still gripping the table edge. Neither of them looked at me. Mr. Hartwell picked up the papers again. There is one final clause, he said. And it is the most important one. He paused. It depends entirely on her decision. Every head in the room turned toward me. I had been standing near the door for nearly 30 minutes by then. My bag was still in my hand. My coat was still buttoned. I had not sat down, had not been invited to sit, had not been offered water or a chair, or even a basic acknowledgement that I was a person in the room rather than a subject being discussed. And now, suddenly, I was the most important person there. Mr. Hartwell spoke carefully. Raymond included a final clause that grants Andrea the power to make one decision regarding the restricted portion of Daniel's inheritance. She may choose to release it to him unconditionally, or she may choose to leave the restrictions in place. He folded his hands. The choice is entirely hers. Cannot be reversed once made. And it must be made today in this room before we conclude. Aunt Constance looked at me with something soft in her eyes. Warren stared at the table. And then Patricia moved. She stood up slowly, and something in her face changed. The fury smoothed out. The sharpness receded. What replaced it was something I had never seen on Patricia Caldwell's face in 7 years of Sundays and holidays and strained family dinners. Something that looked like the beginning of a smile. Careful, calculated, practiced smile. She said, "Andrea, we can fix this." Patricia's voice was completely different now. Gone was the sharp edge, the dismissal, the pointed finger directing me out of the room she had just told me I never belonged in. In its place was something warm and rounded, the voice of a woman who had spent decades performing concern so well that she sometimes forgot it was a performance. "Sweetheart," she said. That word. She had never called me that before. Not once in 7 years. "We've had our difficulties, you and I. Every family does. But Raymond clearly had strong feelings, and we should honor those feelings. We can sit down, the three of us, you and Daniel and I, and we can work through this. Like a family." She moved toward me slightly. Not all the way. Just enough to suggest closeness. Aunt Constance looked at the table. Warren looked out the window. Daniel pushed back his chair and walked toward me. He stopped a few feet away. I could see the effort in his face, the work of arranging himself into something that looked like remorse. "Andrea," he said quietly. "Let's talk. Just us. We don't have to do this here. 7 years. 7 years of Christmases where I wasn't in the photographs. Of birthdays where nobody called. Of dinners where my food was eaten and my name was not spoken. Of reaching for my husband's hand in difficult moments and finding empty air." He wanted to talk now. "Just say yes," Daniel said. "And everything goes back to the way it was." He was close enough that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident he had told me about on our second date. He was close enough that I could smell the same cologne he had worn since the day we met. He was close enough that 7 years of mornings and meals and small shared moments sat in the space between us like furniture neither of us had moved. "We can sort out the house thing," he continued. "You don't actually want Mom's house. That's not who you are. You're reasonable. You've always been the reasonable one." Reasonable. That was the word he chose. Patricia stood several feet back watching. Her face was composed, her hands folded in front of her, her head tilted just slightly. She had placed herself perfectly, present enough to seem sincere, far enough to give Daniel room to work. I looked at her. I looked at him. I thought about the photograph Raymond had kept. Me in a plastic chair outside a hospital room, alone, with a coffee cup on the floor beside my feet. Raymond had looked down that hallway and seen me there, and he had thought it was worth keeping. I thought about the Christmas crossword puzzle. I thought about 7 years of choosing silence when silence was cowardly. Daniel reached out and touched my arm. I stepped back. I had not planned what I was going to say. I had spent 7 years planning the wrong things. Planning how to be smaller at family dinners, how to take up less space, how to absorb insults without reacting, how to swallow the sharp things that rose in my throat and replace them with something more acceptable. I had never planned this. But when I opened my mouth, the words were already there. They had been there for a long time. "You want me to be reasonable," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. "You've been calling me reasonable for 7 years every time you needed me to let something go. Every time your mother said something that should have made you angry on my behalf. Every time I sat at that table and nobody looked at me. Reasonable meant quiet. Reasonable meant don't make a fuss. Reasonable meant accept what you're given and be grateful." Daniel started to speak. "I'm not finished," I said. He stopped. "Your father saw what you didn't want to see. He kept photographs because he knew one day the truth would need to be louder than the story this family was telling. He documented every hospital visit, every Tuesday afternoon, every Christmas day I spent with him because nobody else showed up. I looked at Patricia. You didn't just treat me badly. You didn't just exclude me. You made me feel, for 7 years, like I was invisible. Like I was a guest in a house I lived in. Like my presence was a problem to be managed. The room was completely still. You didn't forget me, I said. You erased me. Something broke in Patricia's face. Not crumbled, broke. The way a carefully built wall breaks. Not slowly but all at once, when the pressure behind it finally becomes greater than the structure holding it up. She stopped being composed. After everything I did for you, she said. Her voice had changed again. Not soft, not warm. Something underneath all of it, something raw and uncontrolled. I brought you into this family. I gave you a place at my table. And this is how you repay me. Standing in my house, in front of my family. Using my dead husband's words to take everything I have. She moved toward me. Not slowly. You manipulated him. Everybody knows it. All those Tuesday visits, all that time alone with him. You were working on him. Building his trust. Waiting. That's what you were doing. Don't stand there looking innocent. You knew exactly what you were doing. Aunt Constance said. Patricia. Don't. Patricia turned on her sharply. Don't defend her. You don't know what she is. You don't know what she's been doing in this family. She was breathing hard now. And in that moment, that exact moment when she stood in the middle of the room, furious and unraveling and saying the most damaging possible thing she could say, everything became perfectly clear to me. I turned toward Mr. Hartwell. He was already watching me. The room went quiet the instant I turned toward the lawyer. Patricia stopped mid-sentence. Daniel straightened. Warren looked up. Aunt Constance pressed both hands flat on the table. Even the cousins by the window, who had been whispering softly for the past several minutes, went still. Mr. Hartwell looked at me over his glasses. The final clause, he said, requires a verbal decision stated clearly in the presence of witnesses. Do you wish to release the restricted portion of Daniel Caldwell's inheritance unconditionally? The room held its breath. Daniel's voice came from behind me. Quiet. Lower than anything he had said today. Just my name, the way he used to say it on ordinary mornings before any of this. Andrea. Please. I thought about ordinary mornings. I thought about the man who had told me to just be reasonable one too many times. I thought about a plastic hospital chair and a coffee cup on a floor and Raymond Caldwell walking down a hallway to get a glass of water, seeing me there, and deciding that moment was worth keeping. I thought about what it means to be seen. I thought about what it costs to be invisible. I took a slow breath. I looked at Mr. Hartwell. No, I said. The word landed in the room like something physical. Patricia sat down. Not dramatically, not as a performance. Her legs simply stopped cooperating and she sat. Her handbag slid off her wrist and hit the floor, and she didn't pick it up. Daniel stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to his chair and sat down too, and he looked at his hands and he didn't speak. Warren exhaled slowly. Mr. Hartwell opened the final document, the binding resolution that would activate immediately upon my decision. He read through it with the same unhurried precision he had used for everything else. The property at 14 Birchwood Lane was transferred to me, effective upon probate clearance, estimated at 6 to 8 weeks. The financial accounts were redistributed according to the revised will. Daniel's restricted share remained locked under the conditions Raymond had specified. All of it documented, witnessed, filed. He slid the final pages across the table toward me. A pen was already clipped to the top. My hand was not shaking. I sat down at the table, the same table I had sat at for 7 years, and I pulled the document toward me. I read each page carefully. Took my time. Nobody rushed me. Then I signed my name. Clearly. Completely. Without hesitation. Mr. Hartwell collected the pages, reviewed my signature, and nodded once. It's done, he said. I stood up from the table. I picked up my bag from the floor where I had set it down. I buttoned the top button of my coat that had come undone at some point during the afternoon. Patricia was still sitting in her chair. She was looking at the table, not at me. Her hands were in her lap. The handbag was still on the floor beside her feet, and she still hadn't picked it up. Warren caught my eye as I straightened up. He gave me a single nod. Not warm, not apologetic, just honest. The nod of a man who had watched something he should have stopped long ago and didn't have a better response than acknowledgement. Aunt Constance stood and touched my arm briefly as I passed her chair. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I walked across the room toward the door. The same door Patricia had pointed at 90 minutes ago when she told me I had never been part of this family. The same door I had walked toward with shaking hands and a full plate abandoned on the table. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily as I passed it. I reached for the door handle. Behind me, I heard Daniel's chair push back. Then his footsteps. Then my name. Andrea. Stop. Not because I was uncertain. Not because I hoped he had something to say that would change anything. I stopped because some habits take longer to break than others. And for 7 years, stopping when Daniel called my name had been one of mine. I turned around. He was standing in the hallway several feet back. His jacket was slightly crooked. His face looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I know I didn't, he started. Then stopped. Then started again. I know I should have said something. There were so many times I should have said something. I looked at him. He looked like the man I had married. He also looked like the man who had stared at his plate for 7 years while his mother pointed her finger at me across the table. Both things were true at the same time. I know, I said. He looked surprised. Like he had expected more. An argument maybe. Or tears. Or the careful, reasonable silence he had always been able to count on. Then why? Because knowing and doing are different things, Daniel, I said. And for 7 years you only ever knew. I turned back to the door. Opened it. The afternoon light came in. Clean and cold. The way light looks in early spring when the season hasn't quite decided to be warm yet. I walked out. Not as the woman they had tried to erase. Not as the guest in someone else's house. Not as the reasonable one, the invisible one, the woman who absorbed everything and asked for nothing. I walked out as myself. Fully. Finally. And I did not look back. The grandfather clock in the hallway kept ticking behind me as I walked to my car. Raymond had bought it at an auction 30 years ago. He used to say that the best thing about a clock is that it doesn't care who's watching, it just keeps going. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. The rose bushes along the front path were just beginning to bud. I noticed them for the first time. Then I started the car and I drove away, and for the first time in 7 years the silence felt like mine.